Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the second session of our conference. And this session is titled Country Reports Memory Law from an Insider Position. And actually, some of you might notice that in an agenda we still had Dr. Tamas Hoffman there with us, but he actually switched to an online session that took place yesterday. So his speech you can see on our social media. It was recorded and it's now available on our Facebook and YouTube pages. And of course, let me welcome you once more. Let me welcome a new guest, new speakers who came to our conference. And let me tell you that I'm actually grateful that you are here because the news just struck that actually from Monday we will have a full lockdown here in Austria, which will mean that every event live at this must be postponed for at least 10 days, maybe more. So this is actually literally the last opportunity to meet in presence in quite some time. And to begin with our session, because we are falling a little behind the schedule, let me introduce you to two excellent researchers who will share their thoughts during this session. That is Dr. Winfried Garscha from Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance and Dr. Francesco Trupia from Nicolaus Copernicus University in Torun. And the first presentation will be the presentation from Dr. Winfried Garscha, who is a senior historian at the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance and also who is a co-director of Austrian Research Agency for Post-War Justice. And his main field of research includes Nazi crimes and coming to terms with them. And today he will present us with the subject, Commemorate the Dead between Belittlement of Crimes and Damnation Memorial World War II and Austrian Politics of Memory. Dr. Garscha, please.
Yeah, thank you for the kind introduction. My presentation will be a little bit similar than that one of Claudia Kuritzidis-Haider, but whereas for her the main focus was on the legal aspects, my focus will be on societal aspects, so politics of memory, culture of memory. And I want to start with this damnation memoriae, as the Latins call it. In ancient Rome, it was the Senate who, after the death of the emperor, decided about apotheosis or abolition nominis. That is, whether the deceased ruler deserved to be regarded as a god or to be erased from official inscriptions, which also included the destruction of the statues of the emperor. Such erasing the memory had existed already before. One of the best known examples is the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut. Her name was chiseled out of steels and other monuments, and yet her damnation memoriae did not work. There are countless examples across the centuries that a considerable number of people continue to worship their idols among leading figures in politics, also decades after their death, even when it is forbidden to utter but their names. Ordinary people do not have monuments. For them, since the ancient times, it has been the gravestones which preserve the memory of their existence. It is the family who looks after the graves. Within the framework of religion, until the 19th century, it was only the religious communities who decided whether or not a dead was allowed to be buried at a cemetery. Suicides, for instance, had to be buried separately. In the 19th century, a new kind of cemetery emerged, which did not belong to the churches, war graves. The new kind of warfare involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Many of them were killed in action or died in POW camps. They could not be brought home to their villages and were interred where they had died. This was true, for instance, for the soldiers of the American Civil War. After the war, these military cemeteries could be visited by the relatives of the fallen soldiers of both sides. This was much more complicated after the First World War in Europe, with its new borders. The majority of these war cemeteries in distant countries could not be visited by ordinary people. In the early 1920s, in many towns and villages of Austria and other successor states of the Habsburg monarchy, so-called Kriegerdenkmäler, warrior monuments, were erected. They bore the names of those who had not returned from the Great War. After 1945, most of these monuments were completed by the fallen soldiers of the Second World War. However, in some cases, there had been Austrian soldiers who regarded the German Wehrmacht as a foreign army. They either resisted service or tried to desert. For those among them who had been executed by German military courts, there was no place on the warrior monuments. This was a kind of the nation memorial, executed by powerful association of former Wehrmacht soldiers, as they existed in almost every Austrian village. The criteria to be mentioned on the monuments were that the man had lived in that parish and that he had been killed in action or died in a POW camp. Ardent Nazis and men who had been conscripted to the Wehrmacht against their will were united on these monuments. And nobody asked what the soldiers had done, whether or not they had committed war crimes or other atrocities. The associations of former Wehrmacht soldiers have been organizing commemorations in front of these monuments, which honored the fallen soldiers, all of them. They did not allow to pose questions like, which was the duty these men fulfilled? Who benefited from their bravery? And which was their task in a war of aggression and extermination? By that, even 30, 40, 50 years after the defeat of the Nazi state, the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft persisted on hundreds of warrior monuments in the vicinity of the parish churches or at the cemeteries in the villages. There were some exceptions from this general rule. In some rare cases, especially in small industrial towns in the eastern parts of Austria, where clandestine anti-fascist resistance organizations had been active under the Nazi dictatorship, you can find monuments with the names of resistance fighters who had been executed or had perished in a concentration camp. These monuments had been erected immediately after the war by anti-fascist survivors organizations like the so-called KZ-Verband. In most cemeteries it was just a monument, but sometimes the bodies were brought home and interred under the monument. What was important for surviving members of the clandestine resistance organizations, for relatives and friends, was to find a possibility to preserve the names of the political victims and to make them visible in the local cemeteries or on central places in small industrial towns. But this was true only for the members of the political resistance. No such commemoration existed for other Nazi victims, like the many thousand people who had been murdered in euthanasia institutions, for non-political prisoners of the concentration camps, and for the largest group of Nazi victims, the murdered Jews. Some Holocaust victims can be found as a memento on family gravestones. This occurred when a member of the family had been persecuted as a Jew according to the racist Nuremberg laws by the Nazis. A special case is the so-called Section 40 of the Vienna Central Cemetery, in German, Gruppe 40, Group 40. Since the opening of the cemetery in the 1870s, Gruppe 40 was the place where the corpses of hanged murderers were buried, without gravestones or grave crosses. This was a kind of damnatio memoriae again. After the turn of the century, hardly any executed person was interred here because most of the death sentences were commuted by the emperor. 1918, the Republic of Austria abolished death penalty. After the Anschluss of 1938, and especially after the beginning of the Second World War, the death penalty played an important role in Nazi jurisprudence. However, in the first years of Nazi rule, only death penalties in criminal cases were executed in Vienna. Death sentences against political opponents were executed in Berlin or Munich. It was only in July 1942 when the Nazis started to try political cases in Vienna, either by the higher regional court, the Oberlandesgericht, or by a Senate of the People's Court, Volksgerichtshof. Out of 2,000 sentenced defendants who were decapitated in Vienna, more than 600 were executed of political reasons. Under Nazi rule, the authorities declined any information about the exact location where the decapitated bodies were interred. But some undertakers told the widows where they had buried the husband. Some brave women erected small crosses or other signs of remembrance in Gruppe 40 already before the end of Nazi dictatorship. After the liberation in 1945, the cemetery administration told the survivors' organizations the exact locations of all people who had been executed for political reasons. Some among them were reburied in family graves, but 592 stayed in Gruppe 40. For all of them, you can find small gravestones in Gruppe 40 meanwhile. In March 2018, at the occasion of the 80th anniversary of the annexation of Austria by Nazi Germany, Gruppe 40 was officially inaugurated as, I quote the official title, National Memorial for the Victims of Unjust National Socialist Regime. Since 2002 already, a special section of Gruppe 40 is dedicated to the children who had been murdered in Vienna as part of the Nazi euthanasia program. The names of all more than 600 victims are chiseled on 8 lying slabs. No gravestones exist, however, for those who had been executed for non-political reasons. For instance, for murder of manslaughter, but also for other crimes according to the Nazi Penal Code. From 1945 until 1948, special courts for the prosecution of Nazi criminals, Claudia Coetzee talked about them, inflicted 43 death sentences. 24 were executed in Vienna, out of 30 who had been executed all over Austria. But no information is given about the exact location of their graves. In the most southern province of Austria, Carinthia, the association Memorial Kärnten Koroschka erected a memorial monument in Annabichl, the largest cemetery of the provincial capital Klagenfurt, in 2003. In addition to an artistic monument for the victims of the Nazi regime, huge glass plates with 1,000 names were erected. Meanwhile, 3,173 names are inscribed on 16 of those huge glass plates. Whereas elsewhere in Austria, just the names of Austrian citizens can be found on such monuments, the glass plates in Klagenfurt-Annabichl show all victims of Nazi rule, including resistance fighters, forced laborers, euthanasia victims, and foreign soldiers. Among the forced laborers are many Polish farmhands who had worked at peasants in Carinthia. By that, the monument in the Annabichl cemetery is the most inclusive memorial in Austria. The precondition for being able to commemorate also the foreign victims of the Nazi rule is a long-standing research carried out by members of the association Memorial Kärnten Koroschka, which consists of both German and Slovene-speaking people. The association had been exposed to harsh critics by far right-wing people who are still rather strong in Carinthia. 10 days ago, the Austrian government opened a Shoah Wall of Names memorial in Vienna's Osterreichi Park in front of the National Bank. There is already a Holocaust Memorial in Vienna. It was unveiled 21 years ago on the Judenplatz in the medieval Jewish district of Vienna. That is a work of art designed by the English sculptor Rachel Whitred. Although the monument was a result of an initiative of Simon Wiesenthal, and although Whitred's design was chosen unanimously by an international jury, the monument has been questioned by many. Just recently, the Jerusalem Post called it ambiguous. The Shoah Wall of Names memorial is quite different. It serves another purpose. It does not arrogate an artistic quality, and it is not conceived as an admonitory finger for the descendants of both victims and perpetrators, like Rachel Whitred's nameless library on the Judenplatz, or the Aspang railway station memorial just 300 meters from here on the place of the victims of deportations, where the 47 deportation trains to the ghettos and extermination sites in the East had started. The 160 granite slabs of the Wall of Names show names and years of birth of 64,435 of estimated more than 66,000 Austrian Holocaust victims, and by that enable people to commemorate specific persons. Each entry on these granite slabs substitutes a gravestone which was not being conceded to the murdered victims in the last decades. And day by day, you can watch people there in search of their relatives or of famous names, and like in a cemetery, putting flowers, candles, or pebbles on the pedestals of the slabs. There are manifold reasons why such a public commemoration of all Austrian Holocaust victims did not exist. The main reason is rather banal. The Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, which has been registering the victims by name since the mid-1990s, needed 5 years to compile the first 62,000 names. As soon as reliable deportation lists were found in the archives, which was rather complicated, we just needed to compare the names with other sources. But more than estimated 4,000 victims cannot be found on such lists. They have to be researched in private documents and other hardly traceable sources. Therefore, for the next 2,400 names, more than 20 years were needed, and it cannot be foreseen how long it will last to find the remaining names. Another reason is the sheer number of names on the wall. At the inauguration ceremony on the 9th of November, Oskar Deutsch, the president of the Viennese Jewish community, illustrated that by a demonstrative example. Holding a minute of silence for every person on the wall would mean to keep silent until the end of the year. The main reason, however, is that commemorating the dead by putting their names on a monument applies only to the war monuments I spoke some minutes ago. But things have been changing in Austria in recent years. I'd like to exemplify this on an example from Austria's most eastern province, the Burgenland. In the city council of Pinkafeld, a small town with a multilingual population of people speaking German, Hungarian, Croatian, and Romani, plans to refurbish its war monument in front of the city hall. The monument consists of 4 columns and a pedestal with 4 black tables with the names of all citizens of Pinkafeld who had fallen in the 2 world wars. In 2018, the City Council decided unanimously that in addition to the refurbishment of the war monument, also a monument for the victims among the Jewish and the Roma population political victims, and victims of the Nazi medical crimes should be erected. But there was a snag to it. Whereas the names of the fallen soldiers should glistening golden letters on the black tables, the victims of Nazi dictatorship should remain anonymous. After a vivid discussion in the city council, it was decided unanimously that close to the monument, glass plates should show the names of the 33 victims. Last year, in September 2020, the monument and the glass plates with the victims' names were unveiled. The place in front of the City Hall was renamed in Place of Remembrance. Thank you for your attention.
Dr. Garsha, of course, thank you very much for your presentation. And now, please let me welcome Dr. Francesco Trupia, who is a postdoc fellow at the Center for Excellence IMSERT at the Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń in Poland, where he mainly contributes to the Laboratory for the Study of Collective Memory of Post-Communist Europe. He has also been working for the Center for Security Analysis and Prevention in the Czech Republic and the Kosovo Foundation for Open Society. And today he will share his thoughts on the subject, No Space to Grieve, recollecting the revival process from Bulgaria's official amnesia and the forgetfulness of the European memory discourse. So please, I will launch your presentation in a second.
Hello everyone, and thanks Sonia for your presentation, and thank you for the presenters who have anticipated my presentation because they made me think about the issues that I'm going to talk about. This is a presentation which is mainly based on my postdoc research dealing with the generation of post-memory of young Turkish people and Muslims in Bulgaria. So after covering the Central Europe, I'm going to the south in Bulgaria, and this is, let's say, like a case study. And even though the subtitle is quite long, I'm going to give you an overview on a historical and political and cultural explanation of why the memories of Turks and Muslims are not recognized within Bulgaria, and what I called the unmemorable. And I'm going to explain you more about this. So let me start with some historical explanation of what happened between early November 84 and late January 85. The communist authorities in Bulgaria started to target Muslims and Turkish people, its own population, I mean Bulgarian citizens of Turkish origin and of Muslim family backgrounds, by changing their names. Of course, there are many rumors about why the communist authorities started to target the Turkish population. It was not the first period of targeting Muslims and Turkish people within Bulgaria. It was for sure the latest and biggest assimilation campaign conducted within the national territory. Of course, many opposed this kind of name changing. So by changing the names, ethnic Turks were becoming Bulgarian, convincing the Turkish population and Muslim population that they were just Bulgarians and they used to be Turkish during the Ottoman Empire. So here there was a very political, strongly political message of the communist authorities regarding, of course, ethnicity and religious background. Many Turks were in opposition to this name-changing campaign and the so-called revival process, and until from 84-85 until 1989, there was also the first movement of resistance against the communist authorities in Bulgaria, which was composed of Turkish people and Muslims within the country, from within the country. Many were, of course, expelled to Turkey at the very beginning. Many were killed, persecuted, sadly, by authorities with other forms of violence, and many were sent to Belene camp, which was the concentration camp between Romania and Bulgaria on the Danube River. But of course, this kind of campaign, the revival process, culminated in the ethnic cleansing of 1989, when the leader of the Communist Party in Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov, said, "Whoever doesn't feel okay to live here in Bulgaria, just leave." So the Bulgarian authorities opened up the border with Turkey by depicting this mass exodus as a gulamat excursia, which in Bulgarian means like the great excursion of tourists. This was the way they were covering up the massacre and the ethnic cleansing of Turkish population and Muslim families within the country. This is a picture in colors of basically Turkish people escaping towards Turkey, and this picture, which is of course very dark in its meaning and the message that is conveying, conveys another message, which is actually going to Turkey was a privilege for those people who escaped, because many couldn't escape because they had already changed the names. So they were already Bulgarians, so no need to escape, or many couldn't escape because they couldn't afford the travel to Turkey. And in this previous picture here on the left, down my presentation, you have the refugee camp in Turkey already. So Turkish authorities started to welcome these refugees and these people, even though the welcoming project was not very successful. Even Turkey had a lot of struggle to welcome Turkish people from Bulgaria, and Muslims as well, of course. What happened after 1989? So the Communist Bulgarian Party collapsed, the Eastern Bloc collapsed as well, and many Turkish people started to come back to Bulgaria. Many people I have interviewed, they shared their feelings that they couldn't stay in Turkey because in Turkey they were Bulgarians, and in Bulgaria they were considered to be Turks. So there was this kind of liminality of suffering and the trauma of the past that it was, let's say, continuing. So during the process of democratization of post-communist Bulgaria, let's say the Turkish people lived in a kind of limbo. Many were still traveling to Turkey, many families were scattered between the two borders, and yet other group of Turks and Muslim families started to campaign for having the names back. So having their identities back, because the Bulgarian system was recognizing them as Bulgarian, with Bulgarian names and with basically a Bulgarian identity, which was, let's say, very annoying from that point of view. So the return was not easy at all. There was the problem of property rights. Many houses were occupied, and even Bulgaria suffered from its own ethnic cleansing within the country, because the majority of the population of Turkish origin were working in the agricultural sector. It was extremely difficult for Bulgaria to catch up during the opening of its economy with the workforce in the agricultural sector that was, let's say, successful economically speaking during the communist time. So my research is not, after the historical overview, my research was not focusing on the generation and the elderly generation that suffered from the revival process, but mainly the generation after. So the so-called generation of post-memory, because I assumed that memories were not on the public discourse. They are considered to be unmemorable in Bulgaria by many scholars, because of course Bulgaria didn't go through a process of self-examination of what really happened. The 90s were a tough time for all Bulgarians, all citizens of Bulgarians, because they had to deal with inflation, economic instability, mass migration outside the country. So my idea was to focus on the memories of the generation after. How do young people of Turkish origin who had their mothers and fathers suffering from the revival process, how do they remember? How do they recollect the trauma? And if this trauma is somehow affecting their political subjectivity and also their political identity within the country, and in turn, as a third way of assuming the problem and this issue, how this kind of political identity which is still, from my findings in interviews, which is still affecting the mindset of many people in the country, young people in the country, is affecting also the political sphere. I'm going to show you also like three levels of this generation of post-memory: the local, the national, and the European discourse. When I was interviewing young people between the age of 20, 35, or also someone who was born in 88, 89, so he or she didn't have consciousness of what happened during the 80s, they were telling me that actually the stories of the trauma are still within the family, and they are affected by it. Of course, this opens up a lot of problems because they were asking for moral rehabilitation within the country, and sometimes they were also lacking political representation within the public sphere, because the main political party in Bulgaria, which is protecting the rights of minority groups, namely the Movement for Rights and Freedom, doesn't really want to deal with these memories because they are memories of the past, or sometimes the representatives of this party are just saying that we need to remember, but also we need to come to terms with the fact that now we don't have communism anymore, we have a democratic system, and rehabilitation happened during the early 90s. But it was not a rehabilitation that happened on a public level, but still on a private level. So for sure, this is something to think of for the people I interviewed in Bulgaria, like young Turks and young Muslims, because they don't think there was any kind of justice for that kind of experience that their families went through. Why I frame this unmemorable issue as an official amnesia. Of course, even Bulgarians remember the 80s. I mean, those people also who served, for instance, in the army because it was mandatory, they remember that the situation was implemented across the country, mainly in the northeast and in the southern part of Bulgaria, where the Turkish population and Muslims were residing historically. The problem is not that there is a kind of incapacity of remembering what really happened, but basically they are memorable, and erasing the past was basically institutionalized not only on a political level but also within the sphere of education. Still, if you open up like a history textbook of Bulgarian education, you don't have a single word about what happened during the 80s, or sometimes there is just a drop of line which is remembering the Great Excursion. So epistemologically speaking, there is a misleading idea of what happened during the revival process. Many people can say that they were not feeling comfortable because they were Turks, they were Muslims, so they wanted to go to Turkey, their native country. But when you interview or when you talk to many Turkish families, they say that they couldn't even stay in Turkey because they were not able to live there. It was extremely difficult for them because it was not their own country. Their country was Bulgaria, even though they were of Turkish origin. This is a picture of a village in the southern part, in the Smolian Oblast, which is bordering with Greece, where many Pomaks live. So the Pomaks, for those who are not familiar with this minority group, are Bulgarian, ethnically speaking, and also they speak Bulgarian language, of course a dialect, but still a dialect of Bulgarian language, but they are Muslims. So they embrace Islam as a form of religious practice. And the accusation goes to the Movement for Rights and Freedom. Like Dojan, who was the leader of the Movement for Rights and Freedom, who is all the time saying that he's a liberal, also on a European level, he supports the Liberal Party within the European Parliament, was the founder. Was a philosophy scholar of the Sofia University of Turkish origin. Of course, he was arrested for his resistance during the 80s, but he didn't do much, according to the people I interviewed, for remembering, not just for exerting control of people's votes, because of course they go to the villages and they remember what happened, they share solidarity, but this is understood and perceived by local people as a way to control the electorate on a regional level. And I have to say that even though the party is also rumored by many commentators within Bulgaria, it is a very corrupted country, he's very successful. A couple of days ago there were the election, and the movement managed to get the 10% of the electoral turnout. So, I mean, still a successful party, which I have to say it cannot be considered, since we have touched the problem of constitution, it cannot be considered an ethnic party, because the Bulgarian constitution doesn't allow any organization to have ethnic or religious specificities. So basically, it's like a movement for rights and freedom, which can be anything and at any time. The first name of the movement was the Movement for Rights and Freedom of Turkish People and Muslims. It was not accepted by the National Court. So they had to shorten the name. So this amnesia is not only created among the Bulgarians, ethnically speaking, so like Bulgarian citizens, but also is an amnesia that you can find everywhere, on a cultural level, also within the sphere of education. And I remember many interviews with young people saying that they had to learn a very specific poem of Bulgarian education, where they said that they are Bulgarians, and for them it was very difficult to come to terms, because they were still in their childhood or at the beginning of the elementary school, and it was very difficult for them to study history and literature in Bulgaria, because they didn't find the space of self-realization, let's say, from this point of view. This is a picture of the commemoration on a local level of the movements for rights and freedom, and basically it was on the 26th of December every year, because there were, let's say, the main clashes between the Turkish population and the communist authorities and the party officials in 84. This is also something related with the previous presentation regarding the names on walls and how to remember it. For those who haven't gone to Sofia just for visiting, this is the moment for the victim of the Bulgarian communist regime. It's a place of memory, which, however, doesn't remember 1/3 of the victims of communist Bulgaria. Basically the Turkish people and the Muslims. Why? On the wall behind the chapel, there are the names of all victims of communism in Bulgaria. There is not a single name of a Turkish person on that wall. There are archives that somehow remember the names of the victims, but surprise, surprise, the name of the Turkish people are Bulgarized. So they remember that with the Bulgarian name and not with the original Turkish name. The people I've interviewed there, for them it's funny, of course. They have 3-4 birth certificates with the Bulgarian name, with the Turkish name, with the civic name, which was imposed by the communist state. And during the 90s, it was very difficult for them to navigate between documents and documentation and birth certificates. So also, like, civic rights were a problem back then. Going back to this monument, you have an ideology of the state which says that Bulgaria must be a Christian state, mono-ethnic, monolinguistic countries, and you have it here represented in this place of memory, because you don't only have the wall with no inscription of Turkish and Muslims names, but also you have a church. Which, it's, giving the message that, they were Christians, those people who were killed by the communist regime, which was like godless. This is the rhetoric. And the little chapel is dedicated to the holy martyrs of communist Bulgaria. So also you have this reinterpretation of the victimhood among Bulgarians. Once again, no space, for instance, for the Muslims who were killed, and actually 1/3 of the victims were Muslims and Turkish. And over there, it's not clear from the picture, but here you have also like a stone-made cross. And the opening of this space of memory was inaugurated by the Orthodox representative of the Bulgarian church, together with the Armenian one, which is interesting because the Muslim community was not invited and is not still invited. I have to say that in 2011 the Bulgarian parliament discussed the problem of the past, especially with the revival process, and they agreed on defining what happened during the revival process as an ethnic cleansing. which in Bulgarian language doesn't really convey the message of ethnic cleansing. It was like a kind of ethnic turmoil, something that happened against the minority groups, of course, because it was communism. The comment of the former mayor of Sofia, Boyko Borisov, who then became the prime minister, was that, yeah, I agree with what the parliament has passed. You know, it was an ethnic cleansing. The implementation was bad, but the purpose of the revival process was good. This is how he commented it. When I look at the stories of the revival process, and especially the views of the generation after, it makes me think of the different European memory discourse that we had still right now, and how, for instance, after the 1989, even the Western Europe started to come to terms with the atrocities of the communist regimes. But in between these two kind of memory discourse, namely the first post 1945 and the second post 1989, the memories of many Muslims and Turkish people are basically forgotten, or somehow they are not placed within the European memory discourse. So we have, for instance, a lot of examples from Bosnia and Herzegovina, you know, like what happened in Srebrenica, and we have certain kind of discourse. What happened in Bulgaria is not even known by the majority of memory study scholars, and only those people who deal with this kind of histories, let's say, they know what really happened. But most of them, when I was talking with them, they told me, like, we have to really look at the things, because, you know, it's still an ongoing process that we have to clarify, because we perceive that the situation has not really be settled. This is, let's say, the only place of memory that we can find in Bulgaria regarding maybe some of you know this water fountain. It's called Turcan. Was the name of a little baby, less than 2 years old, who was killed with her mother during the clashes in '84. On the 26th of December 1984, in the small village of nearby Smolyan in Magiliane. And every year, between this period of the year, the Muslim community goes there. Even many people from Turkey, they arrived in these small villages in order to commemorate what happened. And once again, you have the same political rhetoric of political parties trying to connect with people, remembering just to exert control over their votes, especially in time of elections. And to conclude, the history of the revival process and trying to find justice, even on a moral level, for what happened is debunking the myth of the Bulgarian post-communist transition. Mainly because of the fact many scholars look at what happened in Yugoslavia, even like with the anti-Ceausescu's revolution in Romania. There is the idea that the transition to democracy for Bulgaria went smoothly. Actually, the fact that it was not reported, let's say, or not very much discussed, doesn't mean that something had happened even before 1989. And also there is the scholar Tomasz Kamusela, who wrote, a Polish scholar, who wrote a book about the ethnic cleansing during the Cold War, specifically on this case, was saying that if we look at this case study on a historical level, we just need to understand that the first ethnic cleansing of a minority group, or minority groups, didn't happen in Kosovo with Slobodan Milosevic, but it happened in Bulgaria. And tellingly, as Kamusela framed it, Milosevic had to look next door Bulgaria in order to understand how an ethnic cleansing should be done, and erase from history in order to stop any kind of legal recognition of what happened in history. So I stop here. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for coming back here. Okay, so I believe we can start our discussion. So the first question to our audience, do you have any question right now prepared for our speakers?
Francesco, thank you very much for your presentation. It was excellent, and it is a good example of the state memory policy in the transition. And I have just a short comment. Maybe you can answer rapidly to my comment and one question, okay? So the comment is, one of the former Polish dissidents, Jan Józef Lipski, he said in 80s that the Polish United Workers' Party in the Jaruzelski period should be renamed into the Catholic Party of Polish Nation. And the question is, less Stalinism, more nationalism. Is it somehow universal in case of former Soviet blocs, former Stalinists, former satellites? In case of Bulgaria, did you identify any forms of using the politics of nationalism to maintain the communist system? And my second question is about your category of post-memory. Could you clarify it a bit for me? Because honestly speaking, okay, could you clarify? It is some kind of individual memory or some reproduced individual memory, so the clarification of category. And I have also one question for Dr. Garsha. Also, it was very interesting presentation about this Austrian memory of resisting. I have another question next to the topic. A couple of years ago, when I was in Vienna, next to the university, I noticed the park of Thanksgiving for the victory or liberation of 8th of May 1945. How did this element of this kind of monument or the another one next to the Belvedere for the Red Army monument, how does it correspond with the official agenda of Austrian post-war memory policies?
So maybe we can start. Okay, so maybe first Dr. Trupia, then Dr. Garsha, and then we will have time for more questions.
Thank you, Philip, for your questions. About the issue of nationalism, if you have a look at the history of Bulgaria after the Ottoman experience, nationalism has never stopped interfering the creation of the institutional model of Bulgaria. I speak from the perspective of philosophy. I'm a philosopher by degree. I have a PhD in philosophy. And if you look at three temporalities, the post-Ottoman, the interwar period, and the post-communist period, Bulgarian authorities and institutions have been always created by fabricating a new image of the country, which basically is based on Bulgarianness. After the Ottoman experience, there was, of course, the revival. It's telling you that also the revival process, it goes around this idea of renaissance, of revival of the Bulgarian nation. And this explains and comes to today's cultural issues of Bulgaria with Northern Macedonia, for instance, with the Jewish question, which is very interesting to me. In Bulgaria, they have very positive memory of the fact that Bulgaria saved and rescued many Jews. It's not true. If you look at the situation, they applied the same method of assimilating Jews from the, let's say, the territory which now it's very contested, culturally speaking, between North Macedonia and Bulgaria, where basically it was assimilation process or sending Jews to concentration camp, having in mind that in that case Bulgaria was allied with Nazi Germany, and the ideology was basically the same. Nationalism regarding, for instance, to Stalinism or, like, let's say, the Soviet Union, there are many, you can look at many discussions between Brezhnev and Todorozhivkov discussing about this. Brezhnev was pointing out to Todorozhivkov that Bulgaria was a very strange case because the ideology of the state was Bulgarianness and not Marxism-Leninism and whatever it meant during those days. While the ideology of the party was just the ideology for organizing, hierarchies within the country. So Todorozhivkov was aware of the fact that the real creation of the Bulgarian nation, even during communism, was the creation of a Bulgarian state. And it goes back to the past and why they didn't come to terms with the Oriental picture of the countries that they have always tried to reject it, especially with the Turkish people and the Ottoman past. So nationalism didn't stop. And it was circulating very vibrantly during the communist time. It was, they were, for instance, celebrating the 24th of May, which is the day of San Methodius and San Clement of Kriski, from, you know, the two saints during communist time. They were celebrated. About the post-memory. Okay, I draw my case study upon the studies of Marin Hirsch, and the generation of post-memory. So it's not about studying and how to say, looking at memories that are based on experiences, but the way people recollect the past. And by having in mind that they come with, I mean, they come across these memories from the older generation. Marin Hirsch applied this paradigmatic term for studying the Jewish communities in Europe after the Holocaust. If it's still the memory of Holocaust shaping any kind of identity problem, like among the Jews of Europe or even in the US, in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. I basically applied this kind of paradigm to my studies and to see how the Turkish people who are living in Bulgaria, residing in Bulgaria, they were born in Bulgaria, they are affected by this kind of memory. So that's why it's called the post-memory. It's not a memory based on experience, but on the recollection of the experience.
Okay. Yeah. You may not compare the provisional Austrian government with the Lublin Committee of 1944. Most parts of Austria were liberated by the Soviet army, but the Soviet army made a retreat according to the accords with the Western Allies. So, for instance, Styria was occupied first by the Soviet army, and then they retreated to Burgenland, and Styria became British. The provisional government first had its legislative power only in the Soviet occupation zone. But already several months after its formation, it was recognized also by the Western Allies. And the precondition for that was that the federal countries, the Bundesländer, which were not occupied by the Soviet army, but by the Americans, by the French, or by the British, that they organized so-called Länderkonferenzen, and conferences of the federal states in Vienna, and they evaluated the whole legislation procedure of the provisional government, because there was no parliament at that time, so the provisional government was both executive and legislative. And when they agreed, and they also instituted some changes in this legislation, then the Western Allies said, okay, also from our side, this is the Austrian government. And what was very important in Vienna, you had this four in a jeep. You had, Vienna was different from Berlin, for instance, because the first district in Vienna was occupied by no one. But there was a rotation system, and every month another occupying power was responsible for the first district, and the three others were with the commandant in the jeep. So it was this picture of the four in the jeep, and the whole political development changed radically in the end of the year 1945. When the first elections took place. And the communists, who had 1/3 in the provisional government, got only 4% of the votes. There was a so-called concentration government with one communist minister, but it was clear that eventually it was a coalition between the conservative ÖVP and the Social Democrats. So, and the state chancellor Renner, he was the one who addressed a very humble letter to Stalin, but Stalin at the same time was already in search of Renner because he knew this was the right man for that. But also this humble address is a very tricky one. If you read it, he enumerates which figures among the Russian revolutionaries he knows. And the first one is Trotsky. So this is not not the kind of a very humble letter, but the language is different. But the content, it was clear. It was for everybody clear what it was. And Renner also combined both this opportunism, he had it already towards the Nazis, and a kind of he knew how to make politics also in a position of a weak person. And so eventually it was he who governed Austria and not the provisional government as a whole. And from the end of 1945, the Conservative Party got the majority of the votes, and so the new chancellor was Leopold Fiegel.
I think Professor Kamiński also has a question.
Thank you very much. Thank you you both for excellent presentation. And I have a question to both of you, if I may start from you are Italian, yeah, but you have been residing in Poland. I discovered from your answer to the previous question that you are rather a philosopher than a historian. But I would like to ask you the following question. Are you ready to do some comparative research? Because you focus on the Bulgarian case, but you know there are some other very interesting cases for, I think, comparative research. Also, you know, in Poland, you have been residing in Poland, so perhaps you know that we, although more historically than recently, had certain case which can be qualified as a cleansing, ethnic cleansing case. So in 1947 there was the so-called Vistula action, which resulted in a huge scale deportation of the Ukrainian minority from the southern eastern part of Poland. So perhaps there is some room for very interesting, I think, comparisons, but I don't know whether your philosophical perspective you've been adopting in your research might be you know, useful. But anyway, I would encourage you to perhaps deal with some other cases, especially when you are in Poland. So there is, you know, room for some reflection on this Ukrainian-Polish case, which is although more historically remote. Anyway, there is, you know, some discussion having place in Poland about whether this policy of deportation was justified in perhaps not legal but societal terms, on security terms. So just, you know, one hint from my humble hint for you from my perspective. And if I may ask you also a question, because I've been following the discussion in Germany regarding the criminal responsibility, penal responsibility for, you know, Nazi crimes. The scope of the responsibility has been immensely broadened in Germany. So not only, you know, individual people participating in particular killings or other acts of persecutions are responsible for such acts, but also some other people taken very, very broadly. So that's a huge categories of people which has which have become eligible accused in criminal proceedings. So, for example, secretaries in concentration camps, guards in concentration camps are brought to legal criminal responsibility in Germany, although they are very old people at the moment. My question to you is this kind of discussion present in Austria? So this type of broadening of the responsibility, not only in legal terms, but also in what you focused on, societal terms, you know, possible, you know, you think it's something that might happen also in Austria as it did happen in Germany. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your question and for the suggestion to look at comparative study. I started to look at them, and it can be a comparison within Bulgaria itself, for instance, with Roma people. I interviewed a couple of Roma people who were targeted because their family were Muslims, and they were telling me, like, the problem for us is that nowhere is written that Roma people were persecuted, because basically we were Roma, and we were in the worst position of Turks because we didn't have a country to go to, because we are stateless in the rhetoric of you know, ethno-nationalist discourse. And so you have the first comparison to look at, but also you have the comparison with Turkish people who were born in Turkey. An interview, let me recollect this part of my fieldwork. It was kind of very sensitive for the interviewee. Her mom was pregnant with her when she escaped Bulgaria, and she said, like, I will be always related with Bulgaria because, you know, philosophically speaking, I belong to Bulgaria, but even though I was born in Turkey and I'm completely Turkish, I don't speak the language, but I'm somehow related with Bulgaria. You have some cases also with Ukraine and the Bessarabian minority living in Odessa. Also, I've been working in Kosovo in the reconciliation process between Serbs and Albanians, and I have noticed how post-memory is interesting. Maybe it goes beyond even the memory studies. It's interesting because the generation of post-memory remembers more than the generation which suffered from the trauma, because they had to come to terms with the fact that they had to go on, and somehow, you know, the old generation, that's why I was not interested for my study to look at the generation who suffered the trauma, because they have this kind of wait and see attitude. So let's see if something is going to happen, if some moral rehabilitation of our stories is going out, but of course it's not going to. And this burden is passed through generations, and the young generation is more apt to remember and to seek recognition of what happened in the past. And it's still, you know, a discussion and a quest for today's society, wherever you look at this post generation. I think I answered to your question.
Okay, thank you for the question. It is rather difficult to answer it short. I'll try it. You have to differentiate between the societal approach, which is a kind of hiding behind Germany. It was the Germans, yeah? And the judicial one. Because if there is a person who is charged with crimes, mostly they are Holocaust crimes, or since the last 30 years almost exclusively Holocaust murders, and if you have that person, the judiciary works. But in reality, they are not interested in doing that in a too efficient manner, because they don't want the trials. Trials are very complicated, and many people in the public do not understand why to try 95, 96-year-old people. And so there was a saying in the Austrian government in the 1940s how to deal with claims of Jewish organizations, die Sache in die Länge ziehen, to postpone all the things, and they will solve by themselves. So if the defendant, or even before he is a defendant, if the person who is suspected to have committed crimes is 95 years old, if you do not work too quickly, so you can expect that he or she will die soon. And in all the cases we had in Austria in the last 10 years, you had exactly that pattern. The real problem for me as a legal historian is that there had been a period of, let's say, 20 years when there would have been possible to bring something like late justice for the victims. And this was the 1970s and the 1980s. But in the 1970s, the socialist government under Bruno Kreisky did not want to do that in a too harsh manner. They had some trials, but all those trials ended by scandals, because the juries acquitted the defendants, and you had international outcry about that, and the Austrian government was clever enough to know a scandal is when something happens. If nothing happens, it is not a scandal. So don't indict those people, then you will not have a scandalous verdict. And so this was the case. There were a lot of cases were still open, and they were closed silently, and then everything was over. And it needed 20 years until this euthanasia doctor Gross was indicted, and even he could not be sentenced because he fled into, we do not know whether or not he was really senile, but he was a psychiatrist. He knew how to behave to be regarded as a person who is not able to stand trial. So, but it is over now. Of course, there are still some cases in which the prosecutor tries to compile evidence, but I'm very sure that none of these cases will be brought before a court.
Okay, but please, really short question, because we are falling grossly behind the schedule.
Yeah, very short questions. The first one would be a follow-up to what you just said. Could it be explained, the failure in a way of the judicial system in the 70s, could it be explained in a way by the missing the Nazification of the judiciary? Could it be that too many people remained in the service who themselves had to do something with the regime? Yes or not? What is your take on this? And to Francesco, what my takeaway from your presentation is there is no single case evidence of an official facing criminal liability for what has happened. Are you aware of any cases other than criminal, like restitution cases based on like civil law claims, claims for damages, and also a reverse scenario possibly? I imagine there is a lot of discussion and writing about what has happened, and there are some bad guys in this discourse. And since they are depicted as the bad guys without being ever formally convicted, then they could think of maybe counter-striking by saying you cannot call us criminals because we have never been convicted, and then you can again base your claim on the civil law, protection of reputation, good name, depending on what other remedies available in Bulgaria, so as to, in a way, the people who were involved in those wrongdoings or crimes, that they could strike back by using legal tools to limit the discussion of what had happened, because there is no paper telling officially we are criminals.
Yeah, the answer is very easy, no. Because in that respect, Austria was different from Germany. In Germany, you had such cases in West Germany. But in Austria, the purification of the judicial system took already place in these 10 years when there was this special jurisdiction in cases of Nazi crimes, because no Nazi judge was allowed, or no prosecutor, no person who had been a prosecutor during the Nazi time was allowed to that. They were installed into the judicial system in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, but not in that section where judgments were given. They were in higher courts. They had to, they had to examine if some laws were according to the Constitution, and so, or they went to the universities. So they were not in the judicial system, or they were in the judicial system, but in family cases or in civil cases, and so, but not they had nothing to do with penal juridification. And what was important in the 1970s, and also in part in the 1980s, was that the majority of the political class did not want those trials, because it was something disturbing the Austrian reality. And all of us know that in the middle of the 1980s, this changed fundamentally with the all the dispute around Kurt Waldheim, and when he ran for president, and all the past came to the surface, which was very funny because it had been on the surface already before. There had been artists, there had been writers in the late 1950s, in the 1960s. You had all that. Even in the schools, you had programs, pupils dig into history and so. But all that was forgotten in the 1970s, and in the 1980s it came back with the Waldheim dispute. And at that time, it was already too late. It was already too late, because most of those people who could have been indicted were either dead or so old that they were senile. But the most important problem, you did not have any witnesses at that time. It was not possible to bring witnesses before an Austrian court to summon witnesses, in part because they did not live anymore, and in part because they refused to come to Austria. Said, no, this is the country where no one of those criminals had been sentenced, which was not true, but Austria is a small country, and there were only very few cases. If you compare it with the Federal Republic of Germany, the difference is not that big. But in absolute numbers, it was a very small number, 20 sentences, only 3 life sentences in more than 20 years. And the policy-making class did not want to stir up this in the 1970s and 1980s. But it was not the problem of Nazi judges.
Thank you so much for your question, which I'm trying to answer quickly. It's a big issue, what we're asking, because on a cultural level, of course, we have some artists from Bulgaria and from the Turkish community, which is trying to speak up about that process of recognition and reconciliation also with Bulgarians and so on and so forth, but not much in my opinion. Outside, even Bulgarians themselves, they don't really know what really happened. They are confused. They say, but it was not an excursion of people going to Turkey for vacation. I mean, still, because, you know, at school, there are reports done by international organizations saying that even teachers don't touch upon this problem. Within Turkish class, in Razgrad or like in Shumen, in Karjali, Smolyan, there are Turkish schools where Turkish language is not allowed to be taught. And the education goes along the line that it was a big exclusion, even though the students know exactly what happened to their families. On a civic level, there were some cases of the struggle of Turkish communities. This is when the movements for rights and freedom was born, for having the properties back. But it was very difficult for them to have it because they were peasants, the majority of them, so there was huge collectivization during communist times, so the property belonged to the state, and then it continued to belong to the state, or the houses and the properties were poorly maintained after 1989. So after a couple of years, they came back to their villages. I mean, Turkish people from Turkey, from Bulgaria, coming from Turkey after the ethnic cleansing, and they couldn't live there, so they went to the big cities. And in the big cities, you know, big politics, big cities, you know, no space for us. This is what they say. There was like a sort of reconciliation with the names. So Turkish people managed to have the names back. During the 90s. So the Bulgarian authorities and also the judicial system of Bulgaria started to make sure that they were recognized with their original Turkish names, but this didn't scratch off the Bulgarian one. Even someone, it's very interesting because also some other Muslim people like Pomaks or Roma, they keep saying that, you know, I'm Turkish because it's better to be Turkish right now than a Roma in Bulgaria. So, you know, you have these identity issues that it overlaps with the other problems of justice within the country. Maybe it was written on the slide, but I have to tell you that no one from among the persecutors was brought to the dock. They didn't. It was on the slide, so no one. In Bulgaria, the idea is that now Todor Živkov's is over, everything is in the past. You know, everything is reconciled with the fact that we got independence from the communist oligarchs, even though the majority of them recycled in democracy. Look at the former prime minister, Boyko Borisov. He was the bodyguard of Todor Živkov. He led the country in the last 20 years, I guess, with GERB, the political party. During that civic campaign for having the names back, Bulgarians, the majority of Bulgarians depicted the Turks campaigning for having the name back as unpatriotic, because the weaponization of the political discourse against the Turkish minority was extremely overwhelming. The rumor was said that we need to make sure that the Turkish population understands that they are Bulgarians. Otherwise, something like in Cyprus may happen in the southern part of the country. So, historically speaking, after the Turkish intervention in Cyprus, in northern Cyprus, in 1974, communist authorities were on alert. Say, what is going to happen in our borders in the south if Turkey is going to intervene? Because they knew the first campaign against Muslims happened in 1964 against Pomaks. And Pomaks accepted because they say, okay, what is the problem? Do we need to change the names in order to not be killed? I know that everybody is going to call me Mehmet. They want to call me Mikhail? Fine. In front of the authorities. That's why during my interviews, the generation of post-memory, among the generation of post-memory, the interviewees started to rethink the role of their parents. And it was very sensitive to me first because I was triggering some discussion between the old and the new generation, because the new generation I interviewed, they started to say, why did you change the names? Why you didn't oppose? mainly because they were also part of the nomenclatura. So the communist authorities were going to Turkish people saying, I know that you work for the party, you organize the collectivization policy and so on and so forth. You have to convince your people to change your name. This is the direction of the party and blah, blah, blah. Someone was even involved in some ideological discussion. The leader of the movement for rights and freedom was considered to be a Marxist during the 80s, even though he opposed then Todor Zhivkov. Of course, also the perspective of victims and perpetrators, or those who collaborated with, within the communist, the Turkish minority and the Turkish community is a very thin line. It's very easy. It was very easy to become a collaborator. So if you have collaborated, why do you want to seek justice now? You collaborated. You changed your name. I'm telling you this. I'm going to finish it. That even within the scientific community, the discussion about the fact that Turkish people and Muslims in Bulgaria were not Muslims nor Turkish but Bulgarians started within the Sofia University and the Bulgarian Academy of Science, where even 3 of the Turkish scholars of Turkish origin, they agreed on this kind of rhetoric. They say, yeah, it's true. Historically speaking, we were convinced to be Turkish and Muslims, so we have to change the name. And they did so. They changed their names. Of course, was it something in order to deal with the regime? I think so. Especially Professor Mutavcheva, she discussed many times about these kind of problems of coming to terms with the reality on the ground. In my opinion, the problem in Bulgaria is that the Turkish minority has never had a group of intellectuals speaking from the minorities. Look, for instance, what happened for the Armenian genocide. First, before the Armenian genocide in 1915, Ottoman authorities started to target the 300 intellectuals of Armenian origin in Istanbul. So basically they silence the community because intellectuals are those who can raise the voice on a transnational level, they can bring the issue on justice, philosophical, historically speaking. So by incorporating the intellectuals of Turkish minority during the communist time, basically they erased their identities even on a personal level. And they put them in the position to be not the perpetrators, but also the collaborators. So they did a very subtle mechanism of erasing the past. It was something studied deeply by the communist authorities. And that's why when I started my PhD and then I looked at this, I was very surprised by the lack of discussion about this case because everybody's talking about Yugoslavia. Of course we have to talk about this, but Bulgaria is something that it didn't happen, it did happen instead.
Okay, so thank you so much, of course, for the discussion. Unfortunately, we have to have a break right now because we are already falling behind the schedule. I don't want to strip you out of the longer break, but I don't think we can keep the 45 minutes. So let's settle on 25 minutes and we will meet again for the third session at 1:50. Thank you very much.